This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, we discover Nadine Gordimer's 1966 novel The Late Bourgeois World with our guest Jeanne-Marie Jackson. The Late Bourgeois World tells the story of Johannesburg suburbanite Liz Van Den Sandt, who finds out her ex-husband has committed suicide after betraying his comrades in the burgeoning rebellion against apartheid. Though she lives a privileged life with her new partner, she begins to feel drawn towards political action. When she is asked to help the Black Nationalist movement with their finances, she has to choose between her own safe but boring life and the exciting but risky act of rebellion. But does her ex-husband's failure prove the futility of political action? Nadine Gordimer was born in the Transvaal region of South Africa in 1923. She moved to Johannesburg in 1948 and lived in the city for the rest of her life. She published her first novel, The Lying Days, in 1953, and went on to publish 14 more novels and over 20 books of short stories. Gordimer won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1991. She died in 2014. Jeanne-Marie Jackson is Professor of English at Johns Hopkins University. Her research focuses on African literature and intellectual history. Her first book, South African Literature's Russian Soul: Narrative Forms of Global Isolation, was published by Bloomsbury in 2015. Her most recent book, The African Novel of Ideas, Philosophy and Individualism in the Age of Global Writing, was published by Princeton University Press in 2021. She's written for the New York Times, New Left Review and The Conversation, among other publications. For all relevant links and a list of books mentioned, head to the description of this episode. I'm Graham Foster, and I spoke to Jeanne-Marie Jackson about The Late Bourgeois World by Nadine Gordimer in May 2024. I'm joined today by Jeanne-Marie Jackson, who is here to talk to us about Nadine Gordimer and Burgess's selection of one of her novels on 99 Novels, which is The Late Bourgeois World. Welcome, Jeanne-Marie. How would you describe this novel, The Late Bourgeois World, to someone who hasn't read it?
Oh my goodness. I've actually had to do that, trying to entice students to sign up for courses on Gordimer and Kitsia. And I usually describe it as the best distillation of a crucial turning point in South African political history that I know of. So it is short and to the point. I wouldn't necessarily call it short and sweet. And it really captures this key moment in the 1960s in South Africa at which white liberals, anti-apartheid figures, but often in something of either a nominal sense or an ineffective sense, are coming to grips with the fact that stuff is about to get real, as it were. So the black political parties, the two major parties at the time in South Africa, the ANC, which, if anyone knows a South African political party these days, it tends to be that because they're still in power, and they were the party of Nelson Mandela. And the South African Communist Party, those were banned in 1960. So it's a really big moment for Black anti-apartheid factions for figuring out what they need to do. And therefore, an equally big, if not equally important moment for people like Nadine Gordimer and her ilk figuring out what they need to be doing.
And just to put a bit of context to that, Gordimer's social status in South Africa, can you just describe where she sits within the sort of social aspect of South Africa.
Yeah, Gordimer's a really interesting case because she's not from either of the two sort of white elites that, in many ways, still kind of dominate South African wealth, if not politics. She's neither Afrikaans, so, the sort of Dutch descendants that came up from Cape Town into the interior of the country and famously fought a series of Boer Wars with England and then took over the country officially with apartheid rule in 1948. Nor is she of good English stock. She is the daughter of Jewish immigrants. Her father was Eastern European Jewish, and her mother is from England, but also Jewish. And so they're kind of part of the intelligentsia, but not a part of the social elite. In a lot of ways. And that is descriptive of a huge part of the politically mobilized white Johannesburg sets that she's part of later on in her life. That kind of dominates key neighborhoods in thinking about the formation of a white counterculture in the 50s through arguably the 1980s. A place like Hillbrow in South Africa is predominantly kind of Jewish intellectuals.
I think that's a really interesting thing to know before we get in depth with this book. It's quite a complicated book, and it doesn't explain the South African society of the 1960s very much to someone who's going in cold. So that's useful to know. We also like to know about your relationship with the book. So when did you first discover Gordimer more generally and this book more specifically?
I came to Nadine Gordimer through J.M. Coetzee, which is a weird admission because I have to say that these days I'm much more committed to making sure that Nadine Gordimer's reputation persists and that she still gets read than I am to J.M. Coetzee. But I think, like a lot of people my age, I was in college in the early aughts, early 2000s. Coetzee was the hot figure at that time, if you thought of yourself as being someone who was into literature. And when I read his very famous novel, Disgrace, I had the sense that there was something else there that I needed to figure out to understand what made it tick. It didn't sit right with me. And it's not just because it's a disturbing novel for many reasons. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this will have read it. It's because I felt like I wasn't able to pick up on crucial social codes, kind of like what you're talking about in relation to the late bourgeois world. And Gordimer was the next natural place to look. And I was somewhat surprised to discover that I was much more taken with her oeuvre than I was with J.M. Coetzee's, and then kept on down that path. Ultimately went to graduate school in the field of comparative literature, learned Afrikaans, and went deep into South African literary and intellectual history. But I think what drew me to the late bourgeois world was, like I said, what a distillatory work it is, both of the South African 1960s, but in many ways also of the driving concerns of Nadine Gordimer's career. And I was listening to one of your episodes, your early episodes on Naipaul and A Bend in the River with William Ghosh. And I was quite struck by his description of Naipaul as being a figure who lent himself especially well to longitudinal study. And I think that that's true of Gordimer as well, in a way that it isn't true of many other writers that I love, where they have high points and low points, but not necessarily a clear developmental trajectory. And Gordimer does, for me, have a clear developmental trajectory, kind of moving through phases with what are in large part versions of the same protagonist, a sort of white woman wanting to do good, not quite sure of where she fits in to the larger political scheme of things. And the late bourgeois world is just a perfectly chiseled version of that figure. If I had to teach one work of Gordimer's to try to draw people in, it would be this one. I think that its length is not incidental to what it does. It really is trying to break down the big story of South Africa in the middle of the 20th century into the bare bones of its structure.
With this project, we're reading lots and lots of books. So when you pick up a short one, you think, "Oh, that'll be a quick one. That'll be good." But this was anything but, really, and not because it's complex in the way it's written or that it's experimental in its language or anything like that. In a way, it's quite straightforward, but it's got something to it, some sort of depth to it, some sort of harshness to it that is hard to take down in one go, I would say. You know, you need to put the book down and have a think about it, really. But in terms of this book being on Burgess's list, why do you think he picked this book specifically? And when I ask that, it's really a question about where this book sits within the body of Gordimer's work. So Burgess was writing his list in 1984. What was the reputation of this book at that time?
That's an interesting question. I mean, 1984 is another key turning point in apartheid history, or I should say, I guess, anti apartheid history, because it's right smack dab in the middle of something called the emergency years. So, the years that, if you, again, are my age, if you remember the 1980s, you would associate with movies and newsreels with helicopters flying all over and people in the streets making South African black townships ungovernable was the catchphrase, or not the catchphrase, it was actually the plan. And I think that Gordimer really rose to international prominence in those years, in the early 1980s. She gives a very famous lecture published in a collection called Living in the Interregnum. Sorry, the collection's called The Essential Gesture. The lecture, I think, was titled then Living in the Interregnum, also in the early 1980s in New York City. And so she is really the person who brings the anti-apartheid struggle to this broad, kind of white liberal, frankly, international consciousness. I don't know how much this novel was read at that point. I think the more commonly prescribed novel, even up through when I was in school, I remember it had been on an AP English list, an advanced placement for the non American listeners, it was July's People. And that was from 80, 81, depending which edition you're talking about, and much more heated, much more about people actually fearing that there was going to be a civil war very soon and that many lives were going to be lost. So, Late Bourgeois World, I think, comes back into academic purview a bit later, really in the 90s, when academics, are reckoning with what anti apartheid literature was, how it fits into these new models of transition, of post apartheid. People feel a bit more breathing room, perhaps, to start thinking about Gordimer as a theorist, or at least Gordimer's engagement with literary theory, in a way that at the height of her career, I don't know that they did. So the Late Bourgeois World is a rediscovery, I think. It was actually reissued in South Africa in a student edition by UNISA Press in 2001. So you can maybe get some sense of its comeback story there. It had been banned in apartheid and was then unbanned, actually, because Gordimer herself petitioned against its banning. And, the apartheid censors in South Africa were, as David Atwell has written a bit about in a wonderful piece for the journal I edit called ELH, English Literary History, the censors were surprisingly attuned to literary considerations. And when they reversed the decision, they essentially realized that, it was actually a very high literary quality. So sure, let's let it out there to whatever limited readership is interested in taking it up. But, it wasn't widely disseminated. It wasn't a smash hit upon publication.
I don't actually know how Burgess discovered it. A lot of the books on 99 novels were ones that he was sent to review, and at the time they were published. But I've looked and I can't find a review of Gordimer from the 60s. What he does say about the novel, he says that the novel is about the South African disease, referring, of course, to apartheid. But he also says that the novel, this is in his review in 99 novels, he also says the novel has no political posturing, which seems like a strange thing to say to me about a novel which is primarily about the political situation in 1960s South Africa. Do you think that's a fair thing that Burgess said? Do you think you can support that? And how does Gordimer include politics in the novel?
It's a great question because the same part of his description jumped out at me, and I kind of chuckled to myself because I think he's right in the sense that the novel is about the pitfalls of political posturing. I mean, in large part, it's about the failure of a certain kind of white South African to be able to stop looking at themselves. And the figure of the husband of Max from this well-to-do half Afrikaner, half sort of elite English family. So he's occupying both of these parts of white high society that Gordimer herself doesn't really occupy in any clean way. She's also from, kind of outside Johannesburg, not from a particularly wealthy area. She's from a place in the country that was then called the Transvaal, so fairly industrial. But her husband is the quintessential kind of turncoat as far as his family story is concerned. One of the repeated parts of his history in the book is that he burns his father's clothes at one point. And I had forgotten about this until the reread. And then, for any listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to read it yet, he gives this really quixotic speech at his sister's wedding about something that he calls moral sclerosis. And he's warning all of the guests at this fairly high society wedding, to kind of get a moral grip on themselves, living in this majority Black country where they really are wrongfully in control. And it's a point of estrangement between that character, Max, and the narrator, the first person narrator, his wife, because he's absurd. I mean, he cuts a really absurd figure in the sense that the whole time she's narrating her experience with him, you have the sense that he's kind of gazing at himself in a mirror. He's vain. We know that he has sex with this woman who lives with them for a while, who is described as an overweight student down from Cambridge, come to do right in Africa. And Max, his husband, finds her completely viscerally unappealing and has sex with her because he needs to get affirmation. And then ultimately, I don't think I'm giving too much away here, commits suicide, not even because he is caught in some kind of political crossfire that he can't make sense of, but because he ends up not being able to follow through on his leftist activism and becomes a witness for the state, right? For this white leadership. And he kills himself essentially from shame. There are all these great descriptions in the book on the part of the narrator about him essentially being trapped between who he was and who he wanted to be. I'm not giving full due to Gordimer's eloquence, but I think she is exaggerating that type deliberately to show that this can't persist and have white people play any meaningful part in the struggle against apartheid. And so she's deflating. This book is we described it before we started recording as a kind of bullet. And I might also liken it to, in its length and its ferocity, Gordimer just taking a pin and puncturing the balloon of white ego. And so I think that that's what Burgess is referring to.
I think that's a really good answer. And just to make it clear that the characters in this novel, even the narrator, are not likable people. They are sort of self-obsessed. Every moral action is complicated by either the way they live or something that they say or do. For example, the narrator's, who is the wife of this very wealthy man, who it turns out he has no scruples in sort of shopping his revolutionary brothers and sisters to the state. But she at one point goes to visit her son, who is in this really posh boarding school in town, and takes him treats, and it's a very domestic scene, but it punctures any moral certainty that this character might otherwise have. And that happens throughout the novel, and the narrator is a sort of moody character that just can't step out of herself to see what other people might need. And it's a strange way to write a novel because there are no heroes in this novel.
Absolutely. And not only are there no heroes, this is a novel that shows in excruciating and banal detail just how compromised every white person living in this system is. And it does so completely without sanctimony at the same time. And I think that also probably is part of what Burgess means by the novel not being political posturing, or not having any political posturing. Not only that it takes the piss out of the posturing that Gordimer is no doubt immersed in her day-to-day life, that in retrospect, some people accused Gordimer of doing, right? Because she becomes this sanctified figure in anti-apartheid history, greeting Mandela when he's released from Robben Island, etc., etc. But also, I mean, the fact that it's a book about her showing characters trying to do the right thing when they are daily doing the wrong thing on a different scale. And that one fact doesn't obviate the need to consider the other. The Late Bourgeois World is not simply, it's borrowed from, Ernst Fischer, this kind of proto-Frankfurt School theorist, right? There's a Marxist dimension to this book of trying to show what's underneath the surface that we inhabit, but she's perfectly happy to continue partaking in all of the surfaciness of it, even as she's coming around to what could be a life-altering and even life-ending decision for her. The fine wines, right, that her lover brings over, the fact that she is going to kind of perform white domesticity for the Black activist who shows up at the end of the novel, who we're, I think, led to believe will at some point be and perhaps has been a lover in his own right. Right, Bobo the son going to a boarding school. And this is true, I think, to people's lives still. I fancy myself, I think, as I'm sure many people listening to this do, as something of a leftist, and my kid goes to an expensive Quaker private school. We live with this every day. And I think what I love about this book is that it isn't saying, oh, well, now you can't act. You have blood on your hands, and so sit tight and just mutter truisms about your complicity. It's saying, yes, and all of this is true, and now what will you do in spite of it? And I think that it accomplishes that goading especially well because of its brevity.
I think that's the narrator's journey, essentially, if there is a journey. I mean, it's a very shallow, I don't mean shallow as in superficial. I mean, the journey is a very shallow curve, if that makes sense. She's slowly eking out some wisdom out of this situation, but she never quite gets there. And the final sentence ends on the words, alive, afraid, alive, afraid. It's sort of a heartbeat almost. That's the climax of her journey. How should we read that?
Well, I think it's very important that you just use the word climax, because I don't think it's possible to understand that ending. And frankly, I don't think it's really possible to understand Gordimer's career without thinking about sex. Gordimer's an incredibly sexy novelist. And again, this is a place where I think she hasn't always gotten her full critical due. She is writing about women's sexuality as early as Doris Lessing is, who has a much more enduring reputation for doing that with sophistication, and yet, a surprising degree of bluntness at the same time. But sex is a huge part of this book, and that starts all the way back in her first novel in 1953, The Lying Days, women's sort of sexual Bildung and learning how to control their own sex lives. I mean, Gordimer writes about orgasms in this book, and you can't skip past that part. And a lot of what brings her around to this chanting ending, right? Alive, afraid, is the promise of having sex with Luke, the possible lover at the end of it.
Who is the Black activist.
Yeah. And it's her admitting to herself that she's turned on by performing submission. I mean, she says in the same breath as kind of describing the fact that she doesn't cook, because with her white, more well-off older lover, they go out to eat and he has a cook and whatever. She doesn't cook, but when he comes, she's going to get it together and make a fairly complicated pork and onions dish and strut into the dining room and lay out the food for him and hold up the wine in one hand and the brandy in the other. At one point, she describes him putting his arms around either side of her breasts and kind of like lifting them up to announce his presence. When he's leaving, he pats her on the bottom. And for her, this is not offensive. This is a sort of assignation of a role that she's coming around to not only accepting, but embracing as her only useful way forward. So the fact that she's now preparing to have interracial sex with this guy whenever that happens as part of, I believe she calls it his offering, right? It's kind of part of the deal of what she's going to do, and helping them move money around and putting herself in a position of real vulnerability. That story for her is inseparable from the political one. And that continues on through Gordimer's career and becomes even a bit more frantic in the 1980s. July's People, again, I think is a real focal point here. Also, a relatively short, extremely powerful novel. And in that one, you get the sense that the main character, whose name there is Maureen, kind of a later version of Liz, has this sublimated erotic tension with her former servant. And that's how she's going to come around to becoming a real political agent. So that's why we have this breathless ending. I think you were actually meant to imagine her being in a quite literally breathless position.
Gordimer, when she's talking about this book, she said it marks the end of what she has to say about white liberalism in South Africa. That's a direct quote. In the terms of the context of 1960s South African society and literature to a certain point, what do you think Gordimer means here, and how does the focus of her fiction change after this point in her career?
Well, I mean, I would start with the second part of that question first, because I'm not sure that that's true. I think in many ways, Burger's Daughter is still kind of about white liberalism. And I think July's People is still kind of about white liberalism in the sense that they all feature white liberal characters. I can see what she's asserting in this claim that she's now said all she has to say about it, in the sense that she is no longer willing to entertain it as a meaningful politics in its own right. So I think her later fiction still documents its existence. It still documents, kind of in many ways, its domination of certain kinds of white circles and white neighborhoods. But this is the last time that she's actually going to show the main character, I think, making the transition out of seeing it as the proper way to be, right? I mean, the proper kind of attitude or set of postures in thinking of oneself as political. And then later on, she's showing liberalism as a vacated kind of zombie-like thing. But I think that she's arguing at this point that now we have to have skin in the game as whites. And again, this becomes very literal, right? And the way that she marries sexuality to politics. But at this point, it has to be skin in the game or nothing. There is no room really for constitutionalist, well spun sermons about what politics should look like moving forward. Now, every tactic has to at least be entertained. Every tactic has to at least be out there to be auditioned, including violent ones. And those become increasingly on the table with the founding of Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the kind of armed activist group against apartheid that Nelson Mandela partly starts, and has allegiances both to the ANC in its early days and to the Communist Party in South Africa.
The Late Bourgeois World is very much about protest, but the idea of protest in the novel is not a simple one. It's complicated all the time. So Max, Liz's husband, his failure and his capitulation to the state as well, and Liz's own indecision and stasis, this complicates that protest theme in the novel. What do you think Gordimer is trying to say about the nature of protest, specifically within the context of apartheid South Africa?
That's a great question, and a timely one in all kinds of ways. Over here, working in the university system right now, I think, frankly, that the novel's quite hard on protest. I think that the novel shows protest to be, if not an inert force, at least a very, very partial measure, so partial as to be close to insignificant. The son, arguably, is another figure who protests in his way, in his own very quiet way, at his boarding school. He talks about a lot of the other white kids using racial slurs, and he doesn't sort of keep company with the ones who do. and he refuses to be party to it. He had been raised by these liberal and or leftist parents, depending, I guess, on where you're looking at their own biographies, and it doesn't leave the reader feeling worse about the son, but by no means do you come away from the book thinking, well, okay, that's really done a lot. We have a kind of protest on the part of Graham, her lover, who is an older white lawyer who insists on taking on both white and black clients, right? And that was something that could have probably gotten him in some trouble, but he takes the bull by the horns and does it, and feels that, hey, defense is defense regardless of who's being defended. And again, I don't think that you leave the novel feeling ill-disposed towards that figure, but certainly you don't leave it thinking that he's any kind of solution. I think this is a novel about the transition from thinking in terms of protest to thinking in terms of action, or I might more precisely say sabotage. And the history of the white leftist movement up until this point has been getting more and more into forms of sabotage. So whether it's putting a bomb in an empty place, right, or a mostly empty place, whether it's trying to target power lines. I know that was a big form of sabotage action in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And then later on, as I said, moving more towards violent measures, but with Africans, right, with Black Africans at the helm. I think that you could even see her, if not decision, at least strong disposition in favor of channeling money around illegally as getting away from protest and towards a kind of sabotage. Again, if you're not going to actually do something, then you haven't gotten the memo, right, about how the system is ultimately going to come down. So I hope that answers your question, but I think it's framing protest as something that is now not going to be the whole story.
That's a really interesting take, especially now, I think, where protest is seen as such a powerful statement. And I think mentioning Graham, the white lover of Liz, taking on black and white clients in his law firm, this character is almost protected by power. He's a very powerful man. He's an elitist man. He's got the luxury of protest because there probably won't be any consequences for him, not like the consequences for someone who isn't in his position. Maybe that's something that Gordimer is saying about the nature of protest in that time in South Africa.
It gets back to this issue, too, of protest very easily becomes spectacle. In this novel, but in general in Gordimer's career, protest very easily becomes a performance of being a voice of conscience. And Max's speech at the wedding is, I think, the quintessential example of that, where you think the audience didn't even register that the kind of extremity of what he was asking for, right? Complete uprooting from all of their social norms and expectations. He was protesting with his voice, with his body, in his intimate family setting, the entire bourgeois configuration of his life. And for what? I mean, ultimately just becomes a show. And I think that this role of voice of conscience is something that has been tacked on to Gordimer belatedly. And it's often why she is, I've heard her, I mean, when I lived in South Africa, often kind of criticized that, oh, she was a liberal, right? And ultimately she was a liberal humanist. Sure, she can quote Marxism from morning till night, but it doesn't make her an actual materialist critic. And I think it's unfair because her career in the writing was always very uncomfortable with that role and was always much more attuned to what could be done behind the scenes, right? How do you pull levers? And this book is about Liz getting to the place where she's willing to pull a lever rather than being willing to put on a show. And I think that's a really essential part of understanding why Gordimer is maybe still a relevant and interesting voice.
What you say there about what people said about Gordimer, it's a lot to ask of a novelist. A novelist's job, I think, is to reflect the world that they live in and not necessarily the politics they agree with. Asking for purity within a novel is quite a big ask, I think, if you want to a good novel, I suppose.
And an ask about which Gordimer herself was very conflicted. I mean, she's often cited as being the South African, and I've written about this in my own first book. She's often cited as being the South African heir to Ivan Turgenev. So the famous 19th century Russian writer, although perhaps not so famous these days. I have students who frequently haven't heard of him. But he wrote a book called Fathers and Sons, or really Fathers and Children, Отцы и дети in Russian. And she wrote about him as being this sort of clear-eyed observer and how much she felt drawn to this role of being clear-eyed observer. At the same time, many of her influences are Marxist critics. I mean, she's hugely drawn to Georg Lukács, the Hungarian literary theorist. She's hugely drawn to Ernst Fischer. As I said, that's where the title of the Late Bourgeois World is from. It's from Ernst Fischer's book, The Necessity of Art. So you can see her own kind of waffling on this, right? What should the novelist be doing? Should the novelist be playing an inciting role, or should the novelist be playing only an observing role? And I don't know that is ever fully resolved for her.
In more literary terms, what do you think the influences on the late bourgeois world are? Where does Gordimer stand in the traditions of South African literature, and more generally in African literature? Is South African literature seen as a part of African canon, or is it held as separate?
So two interlinking questions there. So let me just kind of break them down. The first one about Gordimer's direct influences. I would say they are mainly not South African, and especially not at this point. Gordimer keeps up with South African writing. Gordimer keeps up with African writing throughout her career. You know, she's a fairly prolific literary critic and essayist, as well as novelist, but her main influences are definitely from a number of different European traditions. I think with the late bourgeois world, you do see the Turgenevian influence in the kind of syntactically pointed, clear-eyed social realism. It's a first-person narration, but it almost might as well not be, because she's watching herself, watching others for so much of this book. You see the kind of Turgenevian force here in the preoccupation with generation and generational turnover, what kind of expires naturally, that still is walking around the world, but has now taken on a kind of zombie-like form. You see that very strongly in Max's mother, and this well-to-do, perfectly coiffed, made-up Afrikaans woman that really doesn't have any place in the new political dispensation that Gordimer is trying to move people toward with this book. And I think the other major influence here is Camus, especially L'Étranger. We know she was frequently reading that book, and you can see the influence with the telegram, right? When it starts, she receives the telegram about Max's death, the way that the main character in L'Étranger receives the telegram about his mother's death, the brevity for sure, and the existentialist feeling behind even the turn towards a more radical politics. I mean, that mantra at the end, you know, afraid alive, and kind of using sexuality and giving over as the locus of more concrete action, of political sabotage as opposed to political protest, has a very existentialist dimension. So those, I think, are the two really, really big influences at this point, especially Turgenev on the one hand and Camus on the other. In terms of where Gordimer ends up canonized, that's a really, really fascinating question, because she has fallen out of some favor, I think, within South African literature, to the extent that anybody in South Africa still thinks much about South African literature. For a long time, it really wasn't a big part of the curriculum in South Africa, even at its major universities. And in thinking about African literature more broadly, she's hard to place. And I would say the same about Lessing. There were a number of years in criticism and scholarship, let's say through the 1990s, the heyday of post-colonial criticism, where the two of them were heavily discussed as these kind of women figures, right? Crucial women figures for thinking about African literature. And you would see many books, many articles that were about Black male writers, African writers, and Gordimer and or Lessing. That leaves out who? Well, obviously, Black African women writers, who in South Africa, especially, and in Southern Africa, just didn't get near the kind of treatment that they should have many years before. So I have a book chapter. I mean, not to make anyone read my books, but on Gordimer in dialogue, in formal dialogue with Miriam Tladi, who was the first Black South African woman to publish a novel called, she has two novels, one called Amandla, one called Miriam Mural at Metropolitan, right around the time that Gordimer is ascending to this international throne. And people have short attention spans on the whole, and people have limited bandwidth on the whole. And so I would say that Gordimer is kind of the figure that's fallen out, that there isn't necessarily a clear space for in critical digestion right now. Part of that is also because her reputation was so much eclipsed by J.M. Coetzee's, who is more appealing to a kind of transnational, Anglophone, steeped in theory, vanguard kind of reader. Whereas Gordimer is perhaps in many people's view, a cruder sort of social realist. So for all of those reasons, I think now is a great moment to perhaps recuperate or rediscover Nadine Gordimer, because she's writing about these things we've talked about. I mean, what does protest do? What does it not do? What other kinds of action can we think about in an increasingly febrile political moment and political sphere? What are the risks for personality and for character? Right? It's kind of hyper performativeness and deformation by virtue of starting to think of oneself as an important political type of figure. All of these sorts of things that she deals with really vividly, and I think really unflinchingly, are reasons maybe to invite her back into the fold.
What do you think Gordimer's legacy is, primarily where literature is concerned, but maybe also politically? Are there any writers working today that you can see as obvious influence of Gordimer in their work?
If there's anyone who I think is doing the kind of tell all sides, tell them truly, tell them unflinchingly, as I said, not for redemption, but for understanding, working in Southern Africa, it's probably the Zimbabwean writer Siphiwe Gloria Ndlovu, who won a Wyndham Campbell Prize from Yale last year or the year before. I forget. But she has a trilogy of novels about Bulawayo, the second city, so-called second city in Zimbabwe. And she goes pretty deep into the heart of white Rhodesia, white Southern Rhodesia, in a way that is not politically obvious. She's really trying to turn over stones that have just been left in their place, through the rise and consolidation of ZANU-PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, and, a kind of ability for in that country, perhaps more than in South Africa, because the white population is now so small, to not really come to grips with the racial dynamics of the 1970s and 1980s. And I think she's doing that in a way, Siphiwe Gloria Ndlovu, that only Gordimer before her had really done. And I hope also will have a much wider readership after winning that big prize. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't think that Gordimer is a particularly appealing writer to younger readers, in some ways because a lot of what she's writing about has, and I won't give her credit for doing this, but I will certainly give her credit for an incredible amount of prescience. A lot of what she's writing about is now intuition. So the amount of times a week that when I'm teaching, I'll hear my students throw around a phrase like white saviorism, right? Oh, well, that's a kind of white savior thing. Gordimer was like the dissecting white saviorism before that was any kind of catchphrase, and trying to figure out how to do something decent or okay without falling into the trap of having it be this self-aggrandizing, enterprise. And so a lot of the stuff that Gordimer is advocating for in terms of character is now almost taken for granted.
That's really interesting. Maybe as we get further away from the time Gordimer was writing, we'll see more and more influence of her work in writers to come. One final question. We ask this to everybody who comes on the 99 Novels podcast. If you could add a 100th book to Burgess's list of 99, what would it be and why?
Graham, I agonized over this when I looked at your question list, and I went back to the 99 novels. I listened to quite a few of the earlier podcasts, and I really wanted to be able to sign my name to it. And the one that I ultimately settled on was Edith's Diary by Patricia Highsmith. It was published in 1977. It is the most un-Highsmithy Highsmith novel that I've read, at least. I wouldn't call myself what are they? Highsmith head, I think is a... I've read the big ones. I've read the Ripley books. I've read Strangers on a Train, and I've read a couple other lesser known ones. But Edith's Diary, I read earlier this year, and it blew me away as feeling in many ways like a Doris Lessing novel. I was stunned by it. So it's about a kind of wannabe leftist housewife who moves to, as a lot of Highsmith novels do, a dreary, relatively affluent, but not rich enough to be quirky and interesting Pennsylvania suburb from New York, and goes about her business there, trying to maintain some kind of interest in current affairs, trying to write zesty op-eds about Vietnam and ending America's involvement in Vietnam in a local paper that she and her husband found with middling success. The paper kind of persists, but not with a whole lot of readers and not in any especially remarkable form. Her husband ends up being totally useless. She has an adult son who sticks around, who is totally useless. And to make a long story short, it doesn't end well. And it is a relatively long novel. It's close to 400 pages, I believe. And it is an incredible account of how women in mid to late 20th century America, but I think has a lot of resonance with British novels from the time, are kind of forced into a politically innocuous position. Women who have grand ideas about what they're going to be doing in the country, if not the world, are just rendered caricatures of themselves by men who can't get their shit together, basically, and by continuing to clean up after them nonetheless. It's also a really incredible account of day-to-day suburban tactility. There is a dying uncle on the scene who lives, wasting away, in the most literal sense you can imagine, in a room upstairs. And there are all of these scenes devoted to cleaning up, his fluids and trash and all of that. But in that characteristically Highsmithy, every sentence almost the same length, kind of so measured it's creepy, so measured you're not sure whether the narrator is sociopathic kind of way. And it struck me as having a place on Burgess's list because it is trying to engage with politics or political ambition at what he describes, not in these words, but as effectively a kind of second order moral inquiry. So not just what is moral, what's not, what's right and what's wrong, but I think he uses Graham Greene as one of his examples. What does it mean to think about what your moral vocabulary should be? And then, have it thwarted or stymied in whatever way. And obviously also the distillation of the political tensions and tenor of the moment in a key character who is concerned with trying to act.
I think that's a great choice. And Highsmith is one author that constantly surprises me. I think, I thought I knew what the Ripley books were all about, and then I read them, and I was just blown away. They're an amazingly talented writer and seems to understand literary performance better than most other writers that I've read, I think. So a really great choice.
I had to stop reading Highsmith novels ever before bed because they kept me awake through just my sheer, the kind of depressive effect of them, at the same time as you get the adrenaline rush from being so well constructed in terms of plot. So it's the most inert, kind of sinking material with the most zippy plot lines imaginable. No, it's absolutely brilliant.
And Burgess didn't choose a Highsmith novel, so it will be a welcome addition to the list. Jeanne-Marie, thank you for joining us today. I think there's been a really fascinating episode. I really want more people to read Gordimer. I think The Late Bourgeois World is a fantastic novel, so thanks for shedding light on it for us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. The African Novel of Ideas by Jeanne-Marie Jackson is out now from Princeton University Press. For more information about Anthony Burgess, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can also subscribe to our Substack newsletter for free weekly posts by and about Anthony Burgess at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com. The theme music is Anthony Burgess's Concerto for Flute, Strings and Piano in D minor and is performed by No Dice Collective. They can be found online at nodicecollective.com.